As an independent artist, making glass it's a very, very expensive material to work with, and what I'm doing now is that I am working with a small studio in Waterford City, which is called the Irish Handmade Glass Company, which was set up by 4 former workers from the factory, 3 blowers and a cutter. And I go there and I rent the facility and I work with them making the pieces as part of the team. And this in itself is part of the work. It's actually the interaction and the collaboration of their skills, my perspective and their knowledge, their histories, all coming together to produce the work. And glassmaking you can't make by yourself really in the hot shop. I mean, you can set up the workshop to be very independent, but it really is in the understanding and the collaboration, the dialogue that you have while you're actually working, and the sensitivity of the hand, which can't really be explained, it has to be felt. These pieces are all my personal response to the story of what is happening to glass manufacturing in Ireland, both in historical terms and in contemporary terms as well. I have made a series of pieces that are both based on the visual landscape of the glass manufacturing industry and also the actual process of making, because as a maker myself, I have an affinity with the material both in the hot process and in the cold process, and it's something that really fascinates me, and I wanted to express in the deliciousness and the luxury of molten glass, as well as looking at the characteristics that are very, very typical of Irish glass, which is cutting and engraving. During the last number of years, I've spent recording oral histories of some of the men who worked in the factories and listening to their stories of how they both worked and what their legacies were. Many of them, came into the industry through their families or just because of their geographical location to a factory. It was a sort of a natural thing to do, to go and work in the factory. It was at 16, you just went. It was considered as normal that you would just go and work or follow your father, or, it was a good job. And in the 1980s, it was very well paid in here, and particularly in Waterford, it was very well paid. So it was always considered a great job. Very, very, very hard work, long training, a long apprenticeship, but then an incredible status once you were either a master or a blower, master blower, master cutter. All over the world people are clamouring to learn these skills, and yet here we have a country absolutely rich in them and not being used whatsoever. In the making of this work, it has been really important that I have worked with these men, because it's moving them into a territory that's completely different for them, and it's moving me into a dialogue which is very intense about where they're coming from and where they have been. And I think it's a wonderful thing that they have done, of been courageous enough to set up this small workshop. It's only a few feet from the large glass factory, and they are really on this wave of discovery, because it is something that they haven't been trained to do, to run their own business, but in working together, I think that it has brought lots of really wonderful things to them. They are learning from me and I'm learning from them every single day. I mean, as a glassmaker, you never stop learning. It's one of the wonderful things, because the glass presents you with these difficulties and then presents you with these gifts in the middle. And of course, it's always that tension of whether something's going to break, or whether it's, the line is well perceived, or, have you gathered enough material to be able to make something. And the subtlety is, it's a difficult thing to actually get right. And when you're trying to transfer that information from one person to another, it can often be lost. And for me also, I wanted to celebrate the wonderful skill of cutting in a different way than what we would know it as its present sort of appearance as cut crystal, which you might find in your grandmother's cabinet or given as a wedding present perhaps a number of years ago. I wanted to show that this technique was really also about carving into the surface of the glass, and also finding edges and lines that don't always appear in commercially produced glass. And I have worked with both Danny Murphy, who's the cutter at the Irish Handmade Glass Company, and also with Fred Curtis, who would have been one of the top sculptors in the Waterford Glass Company, and also Greg Sullivan, who would have been one of the top copper wheel engravers, and I've worked with all of those men for making pieces during this. I also have a huge passion for engraving, which is a technique of actually scratching into the surface of the glass using tiny, tiny marks, and the type of engraving that I most enjoy is diamond point, which is using a very, very small dental drill, almost like a dental drill with a diamond point, and using tiny, tiny scratch marks, creating a surface that bends the shadow of light coming through the glass itself. And so doing that, I have created some very, very delicate pieces, which are, you know, quite lace-like and skeletal. When you look at them, what happens is that it almost appears that the engraving is not there, and then through the shadow that is thrown when the light falls on the pieces, you actually see this incredible pattern that emerges. So all of those techniques are within this work as well. Some of the pieces are blown. For example, the Apprentice piece, for example, is an expression of just the joy of all the amazing colours that you can get in glass, and I wanted to make this incredible palette of beautiful colours that will cast their shadows onto the table. And within all of those pieces, as young apprentices, for example, the boys arrived at the factory at 16. They were given some very simple exercises to see if they were suitable for the cutting shop or the engraving shop, and then they would have spent maybe 6 or 7 weeks cutting one star at the bottom of a piece, or as a apprentice blower, you would have maybe spent 2 weeks just rolling a pipe on a steel table with no glass on it whatsoever, just to get the feel of it. And then almost immediately you were thrown into, with very short training, you were thrown into the teams actually making pieces of glass. So it was kind of a baptism of fire, and I wanted to put this sort of story together of all of these different sort of similar kinds of shapes, but all different sizes, and you know, a little bit higgledy-piggledy, and also casting these beautiful shadows with various marks on the surface of them that would have been expressions of different ways of engraving and cutting onto the surface of the glass. So the Union piece is made of hot sculpted glass. It's solid glass that has been twisted and manipulated through the hot process. And these are figurative pieces, and I wanted to express a feeling of the striking workers, which in the late 70s there were huge strikes in Waterford over some of the conditions and the pay there, and also at the very end, when the factory was closed, there was a long sit-in where the workers actually tried to keep the furnaces light to negotiate to try and stop the closure or to negotiate a better situation. And so this is my response to that. The reason why the image is so striking to me, even though in the late 70s I wasn't even involved in glass at the time, but a year ago I had the opportunity to do a residency in the Museum of Glass in Tacoma, and as part of my profile they put together some of the story of Irish glass, and without me knowing it, found some file footage of striking workers from the factory. And when this image was beamed out in the auditorium where I was working, as part of our signature of what Irish glass meant to an American audience, the response that I got from the American audience was incredibly strong, and so indignant that this could actually have happened, and so moved by it. And it was terribly shocking for me to actually see that rawness that I had actually heard about, but to see it visually was actually a very difficult thing for me to accept. And it sort of brought it back even more and made me even want to make this work even more strongly. So even though these pieces have this kind of balletic, beautiful, flowing, luxurious, delicious, hot glass feeling about them, they're also about aggression. They're also about the defence of this incredible craft that we have just seemed to have just happy to, just to let go and take it as something that is inevitable. Some of the spear pieces that I have also made are about this call to action as well. They are based on Viking spears that I saw in the National Museum in Ireland, which I think are beautiful. They have this incredible sort of century sort of feel to them. They're beautifully elegant, but yet they were weapons when they were first made. For me, they're very, very evocative pieces, and both work as a triptych and work as individual pieces in themselves. The large hollow form pieces are a series called Breath, and they are the largest pieces that I've made for this group of work. And they are about visualizing the shape of a breath, of how many, when I think of 600 blowers, you know, in the 1980s, 600 blowers, maybe, you know, 800 cutters in the Waterford factory. When I think of the amount of breath that was blown, that was shaped, all of those beautiful, graceful movements of the glass. If you ever watch glass making, you know, it's the most beautiful, seductive and enchanting thing to watch, that you take this liquid out of honey, sort of liquid out of a furnace, swing it around on the end of a long pipe, blow it through these incredible colours of yellows and reds and golds until it becomes its final colour, whether it's a clear glass piece or whether it's a coloured glass piece. In this case, they're all different colours, and I'm looking at various colours of the cooling of the glass, so taking it from a really, really hot yellow through to the final cooling of a steel blue or a steel grey. And it is about both the ballet of the making, because, you know, many of these big glass blowers all over the world, I've been to many glass factories all over the world, you see these big burly men who, you know, who walk around with big, you know, bare bellies and drinking away, and then suddenly you put a pipe into their hand and they are the most elegant and balletic of people, where they move around in a small space and never bump into each other, and it's very fluid and very beautiful. And part of that is the enchantment of glass blowing for me, is that dance. That dance of working together in a small space and having this unspoken understanding of where you should be and how you should work, how you should move when you're actually making something. And this is not something that can be translated very easily. It's something that comes from working and having that fluency and having that knowledge and learning from other people, even though you may not even be aware that you're learning that dance. If you put somebody who's just a brand new glassblower into a space, you see very, very quickly how that dance, you know, is actually very complicated. But if you're watching fluid glassmakers, it is a seamless thing. And when I think of the history of people that came to Waterford to work, I mean, the basis of the modern factory came from Bohemia, and many of the workers came from the Novi Bor, Kameniki Senov area of the Czech Republic, and they would have come here to train Irish glassmakers, and with no language skills, or very few words, in fact. And so this became, you know, a much more evocative thing, because they just had to show through movement of working together, and then invite, you know, the various people into the situation and to learn that dance. And then I decided to try and look at making beautiful functional pieces, which I have called Handmade in Ireland, Waterford. One of them is called Skeletal and the other is called Fragile. And these are also a commentary about the amount of people who are left making glass in Ireland in the factory in Waterford. At the moment there are 10 blowers only left in that factory, down from 600 to, you know, at the sort of the height. And so these pieces are made in an addition of pieces. They're not unique. They're, you know, they're made to be reproduced, but also looking at the delicacy of the cutting again, and particularly of the engraving. So this delicate and fragile and skeletal engraving remains on the table, but it's only a shadow. It isn't actually in reality on the table. It isn't contained in the glass. And then finally there is a hot cast piece, which is a different technique to blowing or hot sculpting. It's when you pour large ladles of glass into moulds, and it's also a technique which I love to use. But what happens is that with this technique is that you can create large solid pieces of glass which are formed, you know, in the density. So you're actually creating blocks almost of glass which you can control in different ways. And this has got a very strong cobalt blue colour, and inside the glass you have all these beautiful, beautiful bubbles that are trapped. And I've used the form of the factory, the actual factory sort of shape of these factory buildings known as K1, K2, K3 and K4, which were parts of the plant in Waterford. And I've used that form to make a repeat pattern and create this sort of dialogue between one piece and the next, with a negative space between, to hold the glass in its shape but without any boundaries. So that speaks a little bit of both the secrecy of the factory and the difficulty in actually breaking into the very strict structures of that particular factory.